So this is Joel Zapata with Dr. Ruben Arellano at the Norwalk Center for Digital Solutions in Fondren Library. Ruben, to start the interview, I'm just going to ask you a few biographical questions before we go into your experiences at SMU, if that's fine with you. And I wanted to start with if you could tell me when and where you were born and what neighborhood you grew up in. And I already know this about you, but just for the conversation, and what your parents did and where they're from, if you know that.
Right. Well, I'm like most everybody, my background is a little complicated, so I'll just say a few things about that. I was born and raised here in Dallas. I grew up in my early childhood years was in Mexico, actually. And I'll get to that in a minute. And then East Dallas, primarily up until when I was like 12 or 13. And then when I turned, I think, 12, about to go, the summer between 7th grade and 8th grade, we moved to Oak Cliff, which is basically where I grew up as a teenager, and that's the place that I've always kind of recognized as my home, my place of origin, per se, here in Dallas. My dad was an immigrant from Mexico. He came in the early 70s. I was born in 1976, April 16th. Share Celino's birthday. And he married an Anglo woman here in Dallas. I never met my mother. I'm not going to get into the details, but they got divorced when I was very young. I think I was maybe 4. And that's when I was like either 3 or 4, and my dad, I guess whatever went on with the case, he gained custody of me and took me to Mexico to live with his parents, with my grandparents in a little town in San Luis Potosí. It's like near the state line between Zacatecas and San Luis Potosí, and it's also kind of near Aguascalientes, this kind of nebulous space where people have family in all 3 states, like I do, Aguascalientes, Zacatecas. The name of the town is Salitral de Carrera, and the municipality is Villa de Ramos, San Luis Potosí, the state. And like I said, I never met or knew my biological mother. And around the age of 6, when I was about to start, I guess, 1st grade, because my dad went to get me from Mexico, he had already met someone else. She was a Mexican, also immigrant from San Luis, but she was from the capital city, and that's whom I've known all my life as my mother. And so she's the one that raised me, and I've always called her mom, and so that's kind of like the brief sort of background on my early childhood. But some of the very first memories that I have from when I was a kid growing up were our memories of my grandfather, and being in that small town where my dad was, born and raised, and I cherish those moments because I learned what it was to live out in el campo, out in the field in the country, living like the Mexican families do out there, that a lot of those people who are campesinos, people from the country who end up migrating to the United States in search of better opportunities. But the funny thing about that is that my dad came from a family that had wealth. My grandfather, he was a very wealthy landowner. He owned a lot of land. He was a rancher. They owned a lot of cattle. They had horses. I remember riding horses when I was a kid, and going out into the campos, to the milpas, to inspect the corn, to inspect the frijol, chiles, and all that stuff. And over the years, after my grandfather died, all that began to get divided up into, the different siblings. So my dad had a large family, some who've already passed, but over the years, that gets dwindled down to basically, small parcels of land. So now we have a small parcel of land and a house in my dad's hometown that we visit whenever we get a chance. And on top of that, I also remember my grandfather being sort of what they called presidente municipal. So he was sort of the equivalent of a mayor of a small town, but they call them presidentes. And so I remember as a kid watching him having to sort of mediate controversies and scandals between different people that would come in, and they would sit in a room kind of like this one. They call it a sawan, and my grandfather was sitting, in the middle in the chair, and then the two parties would sit opposite to each other, and they would voice their complaints to him, and he would try to resolve that. And so I learned from a very early age. I didn't really necessarily understand what was going on, but I understood that there was some kind of mediation going on. Even though I didn't frame it in those terms, I understood that my grandfather was someone who was there to kind of solve problems or resolve any issues that were going on at the time. And so that gave me a sense of sort of my early inklings of what it meant to be someone who aspires for justice, things like that, which that doesn't really come into my life until I get into my teenage years, and we'll get into that if we have time. And so those are the very early memories that I have of my grandfather, of living in Mexico, my grandmother as well, spending time out in the field with friends that, and cousins. I had a lot of cousins, and we would go out and we would make our own slingshots out of mesquite trees. We'd cut down, we'd seek out the best branches that had the perfect Y, they had to be of a certain width, otherwise it would break. And we'd fashion our own slingshots, and we'd go out into the field. We'd hunt snakes. We'd hunt rabbits and rodents, things like that, and we'd actually cook them and eat them like that out in the field. So I got that experience growing up. And so what happened was, over the years, every summer, my parents would take me and my stepsister, who was about the same age as I am, and they would take us to Mexico. But she was my mom's daughter, right? And so she would stay in San Luis Potosí, to see the city, and I would go to my dad's hometown in Salidral. And so we got different experiences. We were both in Mexico for the summer breaks, but she got the city experience of Mexico, and I got the country experience of Mexico. And so we'd come back and we'd exchange stories and experiences, and it was kind of interesting to see that, just thinking back how different my life would have been had I not had that experience, because it gave me a sense of belonging and of knowing who I was as an individual, especially when you grow up, knowing that you're mixed, and then you have that stigma because, to Anglo society, you don't quite look like an Anglo, and to Mexicans, you look too wet or too white, and you're somewhere in between. And so I always had problems with some people growing up that couldn't necessarily accept the fact that, I was mixed. And so I always had sort of like this identity issue going on with me for a while. And so part of that identity, I call it the Chicano identity problem, is that or complex, I should say, and I call myself a Chicano, and we can talk about that as well. So we tend to try to find a way to attach our identity to Mexican Americanness, right? And so growing up, I understood that I was Mexican American because my dad was Mexican, and I grew up in a Mexican American household in a Mexican American barrio. Oak Cliff, when I was growing up, at least that part of Oak Cliff was predominantly Mexican American. It's beginning to change. There's a lot of urban renewal, gentrification that's going on, and that's beginning to really change the not just the identity of Oak Cliff, but also the character, of Oak Cliff that tended to be highly Mexican American. And so I always understood myself as a Mexican American, but at the same time, knowing that I was part white always kind of led me to have these sort of internal dialogues, okay, am I really an authentic Mexican American? Am I not? And so part of that identity problem that I had led me to really dig deep into who I was and begin to study Mexican history, Mexican American history. And I would go to the library as a kid. I lived like 2 blocks from a library, and I would spend, I wouldn't say every weekend, but on the weekends, I would spend a Saturday afternoon just, going through the books, the history section. And back then I was also into like conspiracy theories and ancient aliens and, that kind of garbage that now I understand to be completely nonsense, right? But back then it was cool to think about, what about this, what about that, right? And so I began to study religions, I began to study philosophy, anthropology, archaeology, history. I mean, I would try to gain as much information as I could. But I kind of led a double life, because when you grow up in a barrio like the way that I did, in one that's a working class neighborhood, you always have these peer pressures from your peers that they want you to go out and do things, and and then you have to, out of protection, you have to associate with certain folks, and so I ended up leading sort of a double life, right? And so most of my peers, only my best friends knew that I was what they called a schoolboy back then, right? I don't know if they still use those terms today, but most everybody else, they saw me and they just saw Cholo, right? Because I would play the part. I was deep into gang life, and I would go out and get into trouble, but at the same time, I maintained also that other side of me that was scholastic, that was academic, and sometimes my friends would trip out on me, because they would say, where do you use these big words? Where do they come from? Because they didn't understand, that I would read a lot of books. And it's like I tell my students today, they ask me, how can I be a better writer of essays? And I tell them, well, first of all, you need to read more books. If you're not reading books, then you're not gaining that knowledge as to how a sentence is constructed and how words go together, things like that. And so I learned early on that reading was, like they used to say, reading is fundamental, and it really is.
So I have one question from what you said. The first one, I'm wondering if you lost your English knowledge when you moved to Mexico, and if you only knew Spanish when you came back to the
right.
U.S.
Yeah.
And if you could talk, I know that your neighborhood was majority Mexicano.
You're right.
But whether any race relations or race problems showed up in Oak Cliff or in the wider city when you lived here as a teenager?
So that's a good question, and I used to tell it a long time ago too, but I guess it's been a while since I've recounted my early childhood years. But yeah, so when my dad took me to his hometown, I predominantly spoke only English, and I remember my grandmother telling me in the later years that when I was little, that no one could understand what I was saying, and that we kind of just communicated via sign language at first. But I was what, like 3 or 4. So by the time that my dad goes back to pick me up to start the first grade, to bring me back to Dallas to start the first grade, and we were still in East Dallas. I guess I forgot most of my English, because I came back speaking nothing but Spanish. And so there's a funny story. I'm sure that this happened on multiple occasions, but there's one that's really stuck with me up to this day, where I think I was in the first grade. It might have been the second grade, but I think it was the first grade. And back then, they used to have a large room that was divided into 4 sections. It was one large room, and each section was its own class. And so I think I was in 1C or something like that. And 1C was a bilingual class. So they had one that was strictly Spanish, one that was bilingual, and 2 that were strictly English. And they were all in kind of the same room. And I remember one of the teachers, I guess she was new or something, and she came over from the English class to visit with the bilingual class teacher, and she saw me in the class. Here's this light-skinned kid with a bunch of brown, kids, and she's like, what is he doing in this class, right? And so the teacher was explaining to her, well, he doesn't speak English very well. And I guess she was a skeptic, and so she pulled me out of that class and took me to her class for a day to, I guess, test, to see whether or not I was being for real about not being able to speak English. And I mean, it was one of, I wouldn't say that it was a traumatizing experience, but it was one of those experiences where you're wondering, what am I doing here? I could not understand a word the teacher was saying. I only knew that she had called me to the board, back when they used blackboards. So she called me to the board to do a math problem, and she was dictating to me what I should write. And I stood there at the blackboard, and I would just like turn around and look at her when she would speak. And I remember thinking to myself, what is she saying? Until she started using her fingers to, say 3 or 5 or whatever. And so that's when I started doing the math. But it became clear to her that I wasn't kidding, that I wasn't, trying to fake that I didn't speak English. I could not remember how to speak English. And so it was through that bilingual class in the first grade, and then through the second grade and up into the third grade when I finally became fully bilingual. And so one of the rules that my parents had for us at home was that at home, within the confines of the home, you're going to speak nothing but Spanish. Once you step out of that door, when you're hanging out with your friends, when you're going out into the world, you can speak all the English that you want. And so that forced us to communicate in Spanish with my parents, and that also allowed us to be able to engage in conversation and learn how to speak Spanish. At least, maybe not in a educated way, you know, like the proper Spanish, but at least enough to be able to communicate with someone. Mm-hmm. And so part of, and going back to the what I mentioned about me going to the library and reading about history and stuff, one of the things that I also did to better my Spanish is that I would check out books in Spanish, and I would force myself to try to read Spanish. And up to this day, I can read and write Spanish decently for the most part, but I never learned how to do all the accents. I thought that was just too much. So I'm never going to use accents, so I just never bothered with all that. But I mean,
you have Microsoft Word for that.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm bilingual as I'm as bilingual as any Chicano will ever be, you know. And so I grew up speaking both languages.
So can you tell us what I asked you about how race relations manifested themselves in Oak Cliff, or if you got out of Oak Cliff and to other parts of Dallas, what you experienced growing up here as, you know, since you got back in first grade through your teenage years?
Yeah. So I remember growing up in East Dallas. I remember back then there was a lot of there were a lot of people from South Texas, a lot of Tejano, Chicano people from South Texas that were migrating to Dallas. This is around the time that a lot of people from those communities that used to be the migrant farm workers that would go to different states began to sort of abandon those jobs for the life in the city, right? And so I remember that there used to be a lot of friction between the people who call themselves Chicanos and the people who were Mexicans. And I remember people never called me this to my face because I was light-skinned, and so I think I had some kind of privilege, as you might say in today's vernacular. But I remember hearing people call other peers of mine, you know, that they were wetbacks, that they were mojos. So there was some competition, there was some friction between Mexican Americans that were born here and ethnic Mexican people who were either first generation or recent immigrants from Mexico. So I remember that growing up as a little kid. That was in the 80s, and it sort of still persisted throughout the early 90s, but by the mid to late 90s, that sort of went away. But as far as like between, say, Mexican Americans and other races, my only experience that I had growing up, besides the occasional racism from white people, was really with African Americans, because Oak Cliff has different sections. You've been to Oak Cliff, I assume, right? So Oak Cliff is it used to be its own city. So it's so big that it's divided into different sections. You have North Oak Cliff, South Oak Cliff, East Oak Cliff, West Oak Cliff. And so South Oak Cliff and parts of West Oak Cliff have been traditionally African American. Central Oak Cliff, North Oak Cliff have been mainly the Mexican American areas. And so my neighborhood where I grew up, we used to call it La Tercia growing up, was nestled between the borderline between the African American neighborhood to the southeast and the Mexican American neighborhood to the central and North Oak Cliff. And so my home school was Kimball, which was a predominantly African American high school. And so because I had good grades, I chose to go to Skyline before Townview, which is now the premier magnet high school in Dallas. Back then it was Skyline High School, which is in Pleasant Grove. And so I chose to go to Pleasant Grove and to go to Skyline for the electronics cluster that they had out there. Because I didn't want to go to Kimball because I knew that there was going to be problems there, because I had heard all the fights that used to go on between. My brother went to Kimball. He would tell me that they, on a daily basis, that they would have to defend themselves from the African Americans because they would gang up on Mexican Americans. And in fact, I got jumped twice. I don't know if the audience is going to know what jump means, but it's when 3 or 4 or 5 people gang up on you on one single person. And this happened to me twice. Once was at Keys Park, which is a park that's in my neighborhood, and that park is kind of like in the dividing line. Well, it used to be, it's changing now, but it used to be kind of the dividing line between the Mexican American neighborhood and the African American neighborhood. And so, both races would frequent that park. And I remember that I think I was in the 9th grade, and I was walking around the park with my girlfriend, and I had there was like 3 or 4 African American kids that thought I was a gangbanger, which maybe they assumed that I was up to no good, or I don't know what their problem was, but they decided to jump me, and so my girlfriend ran away, and I just kind of curled up and tried to protect myself, and so that was one occasion. The second occasion, I was this was when I was in the 10th grade. I was coming back from my girlfriend's house again. She lived near Kimball. And walking home, I got attacked by like a crowd of 15 kids. And the only thing that saved me was that there was this guy that was coming down, because it was kind of going downhill. He was coming down the hill on Westmoreland, right before you get to Keast Boulevard. And he stopped the car and he yelled out, "Police!" And everybody scrambled. And it turned out that he wasn't really a cop, but he just, he was a good Samaritan. And he took me home. And I got home and I was all bloody and bruised. And so back, I guess what I'm trying to say is that in terms of racial conflict that I remember personally was mainly between African Americans and Mexican Americans. And you saw this play out as well in the local politics as well. Back in the 80s and the 90s, if you go back and look through the newspapers in Dallas, there's a lot of conflict between African Americans and Mexican Americans, because everyone's trying to occupy the same political spaces, and people are competing for the same resources. And when you have these things happening because of the power structure, the way that it was designed here in Dallas, I don't think we have time to get into all that. That's a whole historical conversation that we could have some other time. But because of the power structure in Dallas, the way that it was designed to sort of tamp down any radical protest, what they would do is they would allow minorities, but I don't know if that's still a word that's used today. I think some people might not be too comfortable with it, but back then they would pit one group against the other, right, to compete for these scarce positions, whether it was in local government, whether it was some kind of public service good. And so when you saw that play out on television as well, then it's like today, when you see things on television, the kids are going to pick up on these cues, on these signals, and they're going to behave and react in the same way because you're leading by example. And so we had that example in the leadership in Dallas, and you saw it reflected in the youth as well.
Yeah, can imagine, and that is a conversation we need to have, but I guess that would be for another interview.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you went to Skyline High School. Yeah, I'm wondering, did that school push you or other Latino students into college, or you tracked more into a vocational program? What was your experience with that?
Well, I do remember that the counselors would tell us that they had resources for college, and they did offer training to take the SATs and things like that. But it wasn't, I think it just depended on who you were as a student. Right. If you were a student that didn't care about your education, didn't care about possibly, going to college after high school, then you weren't going to seek those resources. But those resources, I remember them being there. I wasn't the type that sought them out personally. When I was in high school, even though, I was hungry for knowledge, right? And I knew that I wanted to go to college someday. It wasn't something that was very pressing for me immediately after after graduating high school, right? And so when I was in high school, I was a member of a Mecha group that we had there at Skyline. And through Mecha group, we did local activities. A Mecha, for those that don't know, is Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlan, is a student group that still exists today. And under that group, at the high school level, what we did mainly were cultural activities, and we did some political activism. In 1992, I think it was 92 or 93, there was a big controversy over teacher pay. And so a lot of the students, not just in Skyline, but throughout the district and DISD, organized, and we were part of that organizing group. And we organized walkouts. We walked out from all the different high schools that were participating, and we marched and we made our way downtown to Ross, back where the old DISD headquarters used to be on Ross Avenue. and we held a huge rally in support of the teachers because the teachers weren't getting the pay, decent pay that they were requesting, right? And so it got pretty bad. The police was called in. They had the officers on horseback, and I remember in one instance, a buddy of mine he liked to be a rebel rouser. He dragged one of those police officers off of the horse, and the kids started kicking that police officer. I mean, this is 1992. If that had been today, I don't know how many kids would have been shot because, trigger-happy policemen today, don't know how to control themselves. But back then, I mean, he got arrested eventually. They found out who it was. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that although we did have problems, racial problems between the different ethnicities, when it came time to band together for a common cause, we did band together. And in that coalition, we had African Americans, we had Asian Americans, Indian Americans, and so it's not something that's really talked about a lot here in Dallas because, like I said, Dallas has a history of trying to brush away the different controversies and different things that have occurred in the city as if nothing happened. They just keep going, keep trucking. But I think it's important to remember these things, and not a lot of people remember these things. And so part of my experience at Skyline was not so much that there was racial animus, although there was a little bit. In the early 90s, Dallas had a huge gang problem, and kids were dying almost every day. Someone was getting killed over gang violence almost every single day. I think either 92 or 93, Dallas hit a record high of over 300 murders that year, one of those years. And it was because of the gang violence. And so some of that gang violence spilled over into the different schools, and Skyline was also subject to that. And so in Skyline you had different gangs, and because Skyline is a school that brought in students from different parts of Dallas, the kids from Oak Cliff would band together, and then the kids, because that school is in Pleasant Grove, they would band together, and so there was always conflict between Pleasant Grove and Oak Cliff, and it was between, ethnic Mexican kids. It wasn't, Mexican against black or anything like that. So it was Raza against Raza, as we used to say back then.
So I have one more question over your high school, and then I'm going to interrupt the interview to ask you about your research on Dallas, just because since you're one of the few people researching Dallas history, I want to make sure to get that in there. You were also part of Raza Alianza. If you could tell us what you did with that and what the group was about.
So Alianza was a group that sort of started also in the early 90s. By the time I joined it, I was already a member of Mecha, and it was mainly people that were community college students that had organized, people from El Centro College. In fact, back when El Centro used to have a Mexican-American program, Mexican-American Studies in the 90s. It was short-lived. And so they organized Raza Alianza, and this group addressed, it was more political in nature. It would address not just what was going on in City Hall, but it was trying to bring attention so that the city leaders could do something about the gang violence that was killing a lot of the kids. And it was also trying to address the continued police brutality that was going on in the 90s. And it was also trying to redress a lot of the complaints that Mexican Americans, back then it was still predominantly Mexican American here, that Mexican Americans were complaining that City Hall and that other municipal, offices were not employing enough Mexican American people within their administrations. And so that group formed to address these things. And so when I joined the group, I wasn't an organizer, I was just there for support. And so I was able to gain experience under the leadership, under the guidance of these older young people as to how to organize. That's where I learned how to organize. That's where I learned how to conduct proper campaign to reach out to your political representatives in office, how to make a case for whatever or an argument for whatever case that you're trying to make in front of City Hall, for example. I got to witness that. I got to witness some of my peers go in front of City Hall and make a case for whatever it was that they were advocating for. So that experience allowed me, once I got older, once I joined other groups, to be able to be a better organizer and advocate for community issues that arose in the different places that I've lived. So that was primarily, I would say that would be the primary thing that I gained from Raza Alianza. And Raza Alianza was also a very Chicano-oriented group at a time in the early to mid 90s, when Chicanismo wasn't really something that was very popular, at least not here in Dallas, maybe in other parts of Texas, right? Because the Chicano movement in Dallas lasted up until maybe the late 70s, early 80s here in Dallas. By the mid 90s, no one really recalled too much of the Chicano movement or called themselves Chicanos. Most everyone was calling themselves Hispanics at that point. And so here you have this group that is Chicano oriented and is calling out also the so-called Latino Hispanic leadership for not advocating for the local community, for being vendidos, for being tios tacos. And I could drop names, but I'm not going to do that. But if you go back and if you find some of their newspapers, because they also published a newspaper through El Centro. What was the name of the newspaper? I'll have to get that to you. But they published a newspaper, and in that newspaper they would target certain Hispanic leaders and call them out for not doing enough and for basically, just being politicians and trying to line their own pockets. So that was Raza Alianza was basically a 90s Chicano group that it was short-lived. It lasted maybe 4 years or so. But it was still in the spirit of the Chicano radicalism of the 70s.
So I wanted to ask you how, because you got involved in Metra in the 80s and early 90s, and the Chicano movement did in some ways go into the 80s, I think, and even the 90s. But how did you become a Chicano when the term was becoming out of use? So first of all, what do you think Chicano is or means?
Yeah.
And to you at least, and how did you become a Chicano?
Okay, so going back to, all this stems from me going to the library and just reading books and my yearning for knowledge and, my identity struggle, the complex that I had as to who I was. Am I Mexican American? Am I Mexicano? Am I American? What am I, right? So these questions of identity would compel me, would sort of light this fire in me to go, read, to try to gain more knowledge. And part of my going out and gaining knowledge and reading books is that I encountered this thing called the Chicano movement through history books. And in fact, probably the very first book that really that I engaged with, that really inspired me to take action and to do something was ¿cómo se llama? Occupied America, right? ¿Cómo se llama el señor?
Rodolfo Acuña.
Acuña, right? Rodolfo Acuña. And so the first, second, and third editions are his most radical interpretations of Chicano history. After the third edition, he sort of tamped it down a little bit, and I think we're at the 6th or 7th edition now. I don't even know what is going on there. And I still have copies of those first 3 editions, the first, second, the original copies. And those books really, they hammered home what I was seeing what I was experiencing out there, the racism from white people, and also, because that book also talked about how minorities are pitted against each other. And I would see that firsthand, not only in school, but I would see it on the television and playing out in politics. And so I would say this person, this man knows what he's talking about. So what is this Chicano movement thing? So at the age of 12, 13, I'm beginning to question, okay, so to call yourself a Chicano means, at least according to these people, because he wasn't the only one I was reading at that point, right? It means that you are someone who is Mexican American, but that you're advocating for your community, that you're doing some kind of social justice work out there to try to bring better schools, better education, economic opportunities for your people. That, to me, growing up, that's what it meant to be Chicano. So it's like I tell my students all the time. I tell them, everyone in here, whether you realize it or not, you live multiple identities, and it's okay to have multiple identities. There's nothing wrong with, for example, and I use myself as an example. It's not. There's nothing wrong with, for example, calling yourself a Chicano, calling yourself a Mexican American, a Tejano, an American. All those things are who you are, but in different. They address different things about your identity. I'm an American by birth because I live in this country. I was born in this country, in the United States of America, so that makes me an American. But I'm also a Tejano because I was born in Texas, and a lot of my cultural upbringing has been, framed under the Tejano identity. I'm also Mexican American because my father is Mexican, and I grew up in the Mexican American neighborhood. And I'm Chicano because I understand what it means to have the struggle that our ancestors have gone through in this nation as someone of ethnic Mexican descent. And so I tell them, in all these different categories, whether you call yourself a Tejano, Chicano, Mexicano, Mexican American, in the scholarship, the way that we academics try to put them all in one single umbrella, is not the Latino, it's not the Hispanic term, it's the ethnic Mexican term. Right, and so I try to make the distinction between all those labels to the students and tell them, explain to them what it is that each one means, and they can choose to accept my explanations or not. That's their business. But I explain it to them the way that I've learned it, not just the way that I see it, but the way that I've learned it over the years. And so when I call myself a Chicano, it doesn't negate my Tejano identity or my Mexican American identity. It doesn't negate even my American identity. All these things are who I am, and so that's the way that I see. And so for me, Chicanismo isn't so much, because there's different explanations, right? People tell you, well, if you're born in the U.S. and you're of Mexican background, you're automatically Chicano. Okay, perhaps, maybe that's your interpretation. I'm not going to fight you. You can choose to label yourself and define it that way. But that's not the way that I understand it. The way that I understand it is, to be a Chicano means that you are someone that not only understands the struggle, but you're actively engaged in the struggle for the betterment of the community. And so, going back to your question, the way that I adopted that term was because I was reading and I was becoming active. I was joining Mecha, I was joining Raza Alianza. And then I would, not only that, but in my own neighborhood, I remember I used to work at a convenience store, not a convenience, it's a grocery store that no longer exists called Minyards, and there was one in my neighborhood, and I used to be a sacker at that store. But before I became a sacker, back when we used to have payphones on the wall, a buddy of mine and myself, we would post up next to those payphones, and which were right outside of the Minyards grocery store, and this would be like after school or something, and we'd post up and we would just be trying to spit knowledge. That's what we called it back then, was spitting knowledge to people. People that walked by, we would tell them, hey, the American system is not working for our people. We need to do something. We need to band together, things like that. We were trying to organize. We were trying to spread the message of Chicanismo in the 90s, and people weren't really interested. So it didn't go anywhere. It was only a handful of us in the city that really aspired and took on the torch of Chicanismo at that time.
So in a way, you did participate in the Chicano movement, at least at the last vestiges.
I guess.
Somehow. But I know that you've documented the Chicano history of Dallas and have written on the Chicano movement of Dallas. And I'm not asking you to give away your scholarly arguments for it or anything like that. But if you could just give us the broad overview of the Chicano movement in Dallas, just because it's not well documented and
right.
You're on camera and
yeah.
You can talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, I'm actually working on a paper that I hope to get published pretty soon. I've been working on it since I was a graduate student, going back to, it was one of my research papers that I did for Professor Chavez, John Chavez here at SMU in 2011. And so I've been working on that paper for a while now, off and on, and I just had someone review it. It's not an official review for a publication, but someone, an extra set of eyes, and this person pointed out the different things that I need to do to make it better and to get it to the point where it can be publishable. But without giving away the trade secrets, I will say that the Chicano movement, at least here in Dallas, really manifests itself in 1969. And so 50 years ago, we're in 2019, so 50 years ago, and no one here in Dallas is remembering this, no one is advocating for some kind of memorialization of the Chicano movement. I mean, hardly anyone besides people who lived through it, and a lot of those folks are in their 60s, 70s, maybe even 80s at this point, and some of those people have passed since. No one's really remembering any of this history because Dallas has a very short memory. It has a very, convenient memory about things. And so most people, when they see, Latinos, Hispanics, ethnic Mexicans here in Dallas, they assume that they're all recent immigrants within the last 20, maybe 30 years. They have no frame of reference of how far back the ethnic Mexican community goes. And the ethnic Mexican community in Dallas dates to the very beginning of the founding of Dallas. I mean, I've seen the documents showing people that have Spanish surnames going back to the 1880s, which is, I think Dallas was established in 1882 or around that time. But the Chicano movement itself begins here in Dallas in 1969. In 1969, you had a group of individuals that met in a little town just south of Dallas called Waxahachie. It's like 30 minutes from here. They had a meeting where several members of that went to that meeting had been present at other symposia and conferences that they had attended in San Antonio and Austin like the year before or years prior, but it was in the late 60s. And they had seen, they had met people from South Texas. They had met people like Jose Antonio Gutierrez from Cristal, Crystal City, Mario Compean, who were already, engaged in the early stages of Chicanismo, founding La Raza Unida Party, founding Mayo. So they met these folks at these conferences. They came back to Dallas and they said, we need to have something here too, because the issues that they're addressing down there in San Antonio and in Austin are the same issues that we have here: police brutality, lack of adequate education, and lack of economic opportunities. Those were the three main goals of the Chicano movement. Anywhere you go, whether it's in Texas, New Mexico, California, those, if you really talk to people, you boil it down to those three main things, right? And so those same issues were the same things that were happening here in Dallas. And so they decide to begin to, do something. They want to reform city government. So in Dallas, you had two branches. You had the radicals and you had the reformers. Both of them are part of the Chicano movement. The reformers are trying to do it through the system. They're trying to get elected. They're going to City Hall. They're petitioning the elected officials, and so they used to call them the City Fathers, which was mainly the Citizens Council. It was an all-white Citizens Council in Dallas. And back then, your elected officials, your council representatives were elected at large, right? And so it was all white. And so what they did, they saw the trend coming. They saw, okay, here come the Chicanos, here come the Mexican Americans. They're going to start complaining. We need to do something. We need to preempt the radicalism that will happen. So what do? They appoint a conservative Mexican American lady by the name of Anita Martinez to be the first Hispanic council person in Dallas. And so they think that they're going to appease the community by appointing someone who is of their own, right? But she's someone who's at the very least middle class. And so her husband, if I'm not mistaken, was the owner of the El Phoenix restaurants. And so these were people who had means. Maybe they weren't super wealthy, but they weren't in the barrio struggling like everybody else, right? And so the people in the barrios are seeing this and they can see right through it. They say, oh, no, that's not going to work for us. Because all you did was appoint someone who might look like us, but she doesn't behave like us. She doesn't know our struggle. She's more like you guys over there. And so this creates a rift between the reformers and the radicals, because the reformers think that, okay, even though they might not be completely content with the fact that Anita Martinez has been appointed, they see that it's a step forward. The radicals are saying that's not going to be enough for us. And so you get a major split. And so on the radical wing, you get the Brown Berets that get established in 71 or 72 here in Dallas. So you have the Brown Berets. And then you also had local groups in West Dallas. Because back then, and it's still like that today, if you go to West Dallas, there's still pockets of Mexican-American neighborhoods that still exist. La Loma, La Bajada, those places. The Brown Berets really came out of the West Dallas area. And in Oak Cliff was still predominantly white in the late 60s. It didn't start becoming Mexican American until the early 70s, when a lot of people began to migrate out of West Dallas into Oak Cliff. So there wasn't much happening in Oak Cliff, but most of it was West Dallas and East Dallas as well. And so out of these barrios in East Dallas and West Dallas, you get groups that were created by young people, Chicano groups. You had the Chicano Youth Association that came out of West Dallas, and these people were, they would show up to meetings that were being conducted by the city and by different offices of the government to disrupt, the typical radicalism that you would expect from these kinds of groups. They would show up with placards and with, horns and disrupt the meeting, and they would call attention to the fact that, someone just got killed by the police the night before or the week before. And so what really galvanized, and at first most of the Mexican American population wasn't really getting involved, right? Because that's been the tradition, unfortunately, among Mexican Americans, that that's why they were called the sleeping giant for a long time, because they didn't get involved in politics. And so that was what Dallas was like. Most Mexican Americans just didn't want to rock the boat. They just went with the flow. And so it wasn't until people are getting killed by the police, and until Santos Rodriguez gets killed as well in 1973, that a lot of the Mexican Americans that were on the fence, they say, okay, enough is enough. And so really it takes people getting killed, young kids at the age of 11 getting killed, for a lot of the people in the community to begin to really get fired up about making a change. And so what ends up happening is that there used to be some very restrictive codes as to who could join the police department, who could join the fire department. And so those eventually get changed. And so part of the codes was that you had to be of a certain height, and that you had to, I think, also lift so much weight. And so some of these codes, some of these rules and the restrictions, by definition, they automatically disqualified Mexican Americans, because they didn't, I guess Mexican Americans were not tall enough, to qualify for some of them. And so that begins to get changed. So those things get changed. And then the schools also begin to get addressed, even though they're still not, they didn't become really fully segregated until, if I'm not mistaken, the 90s, I want to say. Maybe I'm mistaken, but it took a long time for Dallas schools to fully desegregate. And that's one of the issues that was ongoing since the Chicano movement days, is that Chicanos were complaining that they were using Chicanos to mark off that a school was desegregated by marking them white. And in fact, in my birth certificate, if you look at it, the original one from 1976, it marks me as white. And so, and my wife's as well. She's from the same era, and hers says white on her birth certificate. She's fourth generation Mexican American, and it says white on her birth certificate as well. So what the system was doing, the people that were in power were doing, they were using Mexican Americans to claim that they were desegregating the schools, when in fact all the white kids were still going to their charter schools and their private schools and whatnot, and everybody else was still, getting miseducated, as I like to call it.
So moving on to your own personal history, when you graduated high school, what did you do after high school into the point you started going into college? You
don't want to ask the obvious question?
Go ahead. What's the obvious question? I'm not sure which one it is.
Why'd I join the Army?
Well, I was going to get there, but did you go directly to the Army?
Yeah, I did.
Why did you join it?
So when I was in Mecha, I was in Raza Alianza, and so when I was a junior, especially, is when I started noticing that a lot of the seniors, the kids that were ahead of me, that I knew, because I didn't really, when you're a freshman and a sophomore, you don't really know the juniors and the seniors that well, right? It's not until you get to be a sophomore and junior that you know who these people are. So the people that were ahead of me, these seniors that were graduating, I would ask them, so what are you going to do now that you're graduating? Because it's a big accomplishment. Back, one of the things, going back to the Chicano movement, that they were trying to address is that there was a high instance of dropouts within the community, right? And so they were trying to figure out what it was that they could do within the school system to keep kids in school, right? A lot of kids were tracked, like you were saying earlier, they would track them to trade jobs instead of college. Or another historical thing that occurred is that students were held back, for a number of years because they couldn't speak English, apparently, properly, right? And so that's part of the problem. And so it became a cycle that kids, they knew that their siblings or their mom and dad had dropped out, and so they figured they could drop out too. And so it just became this cycle of dropping out. And so they were trying to correct this in the Chicano movement days, and it was still going on in the 90s. You still had a high instance of dropout rates in the 90s. And so it was a big accomplishment for someone to graduate high school. And so I would ask, the seniors, so what are you going to do now that you're going to graduate? They would tell me, oh, well, I'm going to the Marines. Oh, well, I'm joining the Army. Que este que el otro. And I would be like, dude, you're going to join the Army? You're going to go fight for this country that doesn't do anything for us? I would tell them just like that. I remember the words exactly. That's how I would tell them, because I had it down to a perfect little, what do you call it, sound bite, right? And so that would be my pitch, and I would get them thinking, oh, you're right, maybe, But, they ended up going anyway. But here I am, the kid, who was a machista, who was in Raza Alianza, who was an activist, who would always rail against the American system. And then what do I do when I graduate? I go to the Army too. So my decision to go to the Army had a lot more to do, not because I was being super patriotic or anything like that. It was because I needed to get away, because by the time I get into my senior year, I was getting too deeply involved in some movidas and some ondas that were could have been very detrimental to my health and my life, right? So I decided that it was better for me to take some time off to get away from the barrio and go do something else. And my dad even said, look, I don't care how I do it. I'll get into debt, but if you want to go to college, I'll pay for it, right? So there's this big misconception. I don't know if it's still true anymore, but back then there used to be this big misconception that Mexican American parents weren't really the kind of parent that would push their kids to go to school. And that's I've always known that to be a huge misconception, because even within my own family, going back to my dad, who was a Mexican immigrant, who only made it past to the 6th grade, right, was pushing me to go to. He wasn't the because I knew parents. Some of my friends back then, they would once they graduated, they would try to force them to work with them as plumbers, electricians, do construction work, that kind of stuff, and to help out with the family. And my dad wasn't like that, So you had both, and so I knew that was a lie. And so here's my dad telling me, and I told my dad, look, Dad, I really appreciate what you want to do for me, but if I join the military, they're going to pay for my college, which was what they were promising back then. And I think back then it was like $30,000 for the GI Bill, which is nothing really if you come. But to me, when I saw $30,000 on paper, I was like, wow, that's a lot of money. And nowadays it's like you barely pay for a year here at SMU with $30,000, right? I mean, it's really nothing if you think about it. So I ended up going to the Army, and almost didn't make it because the doctor was saying that I had flat feet, which I was like, how can I have flat feet if I'm a very good runner? I mean, I used to go to Keys Park all the time, and I used to run, long distance and sprints. So I'm you can't tell now, but I used to be a runner, and so they almost didn't accept me because I had flat feet. But I convinced them to accept me, and I guess I scored high enough, because you have to take a test called the ASVAB. I don't know if it's still called that, but it was called the ASVAB. And I guess I placed in a certain level where I got to pick what kind of job that I wanted to do. What would be my job in the military? They call it your MOS, I believe, military occupational something or other. It's been a long time, and so I was able to pick, and I picked what sounded kind of fancy, chemical engineer, right? So I was thinking, wow, that sounds pretty neat. Maybe I'll learn, something that has to do with chemistry. It turned out to be something completely different that I won't get into. But anyway, so here I am. I signed up, and for that specific MOS, so most enlistments are 4 years. I don't know if it's still the same. It used to be 4 years. That one only required 3 years. That's one of the reasons why I picked it, because I said, okay, I'm not going to do 4 years. I'm just going to do 3 years. I'm going to get my benefits. I'm going to get, money for college. I'm going to do I used to call it doing my time. Fíjate? I'm going to do my time. I'm going to get out, and then I'm going to go to college. But as life would have it, once you start something, it's kind of hard to break away from it. So going back to this idea of racial tension and animosity, I don't know if it's still the same today, but 20-something years ago, because I graduated in 1994. And I got out of the Army in 1997, so it was 3 years. In the 90s, in the Army, at least the post that I ended up in, because I went to Fort Knox, Kentucky for my basic training for 2 months. Then I went to, from there they sent me to Aberdeen, Maryland for 3 months of what they call AIT Advanced something training. And then from there, that's when you get sent to your post. And I got sent to Fort Stewart, Georgia. I was basically in the swamps, like 45 minutes from Savannah, Georgia. We used to go to Savannah all the time to party on River Street and whatnot. But at Fort Stewart, Georgia, it was just like being back home. You had your cliques, you had your Raza, your Mexican Americans that hung out together, African Americans that hung out together, Los Anglos, the white soldiers hung out together. Puerto Ricans, they either had their own group or they would hang out with African Americans that were from New York. We used to call them the New Yorkans. And the others, the OTMs, we used to call them, the other than Mexican, Hispanics. And they all had their own cliques, So even in the Army, so here I am thinking that I'm leaving the neighborhood, that I'm leaving, being part of that environment behind, and I get into the Army, and everybody's drinking, everybody is doing drugs, they're smoking weed, they're doing coke. I mean, I don't know if it's still the same. That's the way it was when I was in the Army in Fort Stewart. So, and so people were getting into fights all the time. In fact, the very first night that I was at Fort Stewart, I was using the payphone. I was calling home, and some dude, I don't know who he was, hit me up, pulled out a knife, and threatened me. He told me to give him my wallet, and I was like, dude, I just got here. I don't have anything, and he took off. That's how bad it was. That's how bad it was. And so here I am thinking that I'm going to join the military to get away from all this stuff, and I ended up getting right back into it in a different way. So during the day, it's like being at work when you're in the military. A lot of people don't realize, people that have never been in the military don't realize, you go to your job, you do your 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, sometimes a weekend, except when you're in the field, that's 24/7. You get time off to sleep, but you have to rotate to, train as scouts and train to keep watch and that sort of stuff. But it was basically like being back in Dallas in the neighborhood. And on the weekends, most people that are in the Army, everything changed after 9/11. I'm sure that it's different now. But before, pre-9/11, most everybody that was in the Army, if you weren't someone who was career military or who was super patriotic, you were just there because you had a job, you were getting income, or you were trying to get money for college. And so most people didn't want to be there, is what I'm trying to say. And so on the weekends, people would get super drunk, people would go out partying. I mean, the incidence of DUIs was high, sky high. People getting killed in the bricks, we used to call them the bricks, the barracks, we used to call them the bricks. People getting killed, people getting stabbed, people getting shot. I mean, it was pretty bad, man. It was. I mean, so that was my experience. I mean, don't get me wrong. I had a great experience being in the Army. It taught me discipline. Taught me how to train and how to get physically fit, even though you can't tell anymore. But so it was good for that. I learned some skills. I'm not gonna lie. I learned a trade, which ended up not being really. I mean, it was tangentially related to chemicals. It was more about being a mechanic of chemical equipment. So my official title was Quartermaster Chemical Equipment Repairer. That's what I did. And so my duty, in theory, had we ever gone to war, because I was never sent anywhere, was to decontaminate personnel and equipment with a machine that hose everybody down to make sure that they're not contaminated with some kind of chemical agent, right? And so because of that, because I worked with chemicals, my hands began to crack and get really, my skin was really flaky, and so what they did towards the end of my stint in the Army is, like, I think the last 6 months, they pulled me off my duties, and I was mainly doing like clerical work. But a lot of people assume that because I went to college and I was in the Army that the military paid for my schooling. I didn't get anything from the military, not a single dime, a penny. In fact, they took money from me, and I'll tell you how they did it. So because I was one of the people that was in charge of the equipment, we went out to the field once, and when you went out to the field, you would stay out there for months at a time. a month and a half, sometimes 2 months. So we were out there. I think that was the one instance that we went out there when this incident occurred. We had been out in the field. We were going to be there for 6 weeks. We'd been there 2 weeks. Back then, they had this super duper computer that the military had just purchased from who knows who. And they were testing it out. It was supposed to be some kind of logistical computer that would allow the different leadership to be able to come up with strategic war plans and stuff like that. And so I was assigned responsibility of taking care of this computer. And so, when you're in the field, you set up huge tents. You have your personal private tents, but then you have these huge tents for the operations, right? And so that's where I would sleep because I was in charge of this computer. And one night, as I was asleep, and I'm thinking, you're in the Army, right? You're in the field. It never crossed my mind that I would wake up in the morning and that the computer would be gone. Someone stole the computer in the field, this super duper computer. And so what happened was I was under investigation because they thought that I had planned and coordinated this theft with someone else. And since I denied the whole thing and they couldn't prove it, they docked me every month until I got out of the Army to pay back that computer. So, in fact, the Army owes me. So, there you go. So that's my experience. I don't know what you've heard from someone else, but that was my experience in the Army.
I wish I knew where that computer was.
Right.
But so after the Army, did you come back to Dallas? What did you do afterwards?
Yeah. So after the Army, there was a friend that I met out there from California. He was from Inglewood, California, and he wasn't sure if he was going to go back to California because he was kind of in the same boat that I was. He had joined the military to get away from all that nonsense that he was involved in back in Inglewood. And so, he would ask me about, Dallas and Texas, and I would tell him, yeah, man, whenever you get out, because he got in about 6 months after I did. So when I got out, he still had he did the full 4 years, so he still had a year and 6 months left to go. So I came back to Dallas, and then he joined me after he got out. We got an apartment down in southeast Oak Cliff, kind of near Redbird area. And but I've kind of lost track of him. I don't know. I think last I heard he was still in Dallas. I ran into his brother a couple of years ago, and he seems to be doing well. I need to reach out to him. But anyway, so he got out, and he came and he joined me. And, we at that point in time, after I got out of the Army, see, one thing that I haven't mentioned in all this is that I've always been an avid music lover, and so my brother was a DJ. He's 3 years older than I am. So when I was in junior high, he was already in high school and he was DJing. He would do a lot of house parties and quinceañeras and bodas and stuff like that. And he had all this equipment, stacks of records, which I now have. I'd heard most of that stuff, and I'm an avid record collector as well. So I have a lot of records. In fact, I need to get rid of some. But
you could donate them to the SMU.
I could. And so. So I kind of followed in his footsteps. I began to dabble in DJing, and I had a little crew. And so occasionally, it's not something that I did, all the time, but occasionally I would get a gig to go play at a house party or a quinceañera. And so I did that for a while. And so while I was in the Army, I met a guy who was also from California who was a DJ and who happened to take all his equipment out with him to Fort Stewart. And you would go to his room, to the barracks, and he would have his stereo equipment, hooked up, and his records, and he would play records, and we'd get together, and we would talk about maybe pursuing something in the future, collaborating, doing something together. So when I got back from the Army, I was trying to get into the music business. So there was a gentleman in South Oak Cliff who was a producer of sorts, and it turned out to be a scam artist. And he took a lot of people's money. He fooled me as well. He took a lot of my money, thinking that he was producing my music, and turned out to be a huge scam. And so that kind of discouraged me a little bit. And so I left it behind. And around that same time is when I met. Well, I should backtrack. So around that time, I had met this young lady who introduced me to some people that I later understood to be Aztec dancers, right? So she had a friend who was part of the group here in Dallas, and there's like 4 or 5 groups now, but back then there was only a few. There was like 2 or 3 groups, and each one had splintered off of like the founding group, and then that one splintered off, and then another group splintered off of them. So that created the first 3 groups in Dallas. That's a whole other history as well. And so, and I should have backtracked a little more. So my buddy who was in the Army with me, that was from Inglewood, we would get, together every now and then and philosophize. We'd be drinking and stuff, and we would talk about how, because I grew up Catholic. My family's Catholic still, but around the age of 12 and 13, like going back to what I was saying about, researching and reading books and reading about other religions, I began to question religion altogether, right? And so I sort of lost my religion or my faith, or however you want to call it, when I was a teenager. I was tangentially still, Catholic, because culturally Catholic, with the family and doing things, but I'm not really a believer, and I haven't been for a long time. And so when I was in the Army, we would talk about, hey man, wouldn't it be cool to revive the old Aztec religion? And we would even fantasize about, sacrificing people, we'd have some stupid conversations. And so when I met these people that were Aztec dancers, I was like, whoa. And the reason that I was able to meet them is because my girlfriend, she knew that I was all into this stuff. I would have a bunch of Aztec stuff on the wall, like pictures and, iconography, statuettes, things like that. And I would always talk about, our ancestors, the Aztecs this and the Aztecs that. And so when she met them through her friend, she was like, oh yeah, my boyfriend, he's all into this stuff. You should probably meet him. And that changed my world forever. So this is around the same time that I was getting discouraged from getting into the music business. And then I meet these people that are Aztec dancers, and that really changed my direction forever, because it wasn't, even though I had always wanted to come back to college, I hadn't done it up to that point. This was in the late 90s. This was 99, 2000. So I had already been out of the Army 3-4 years, and I was just going for, I would hold jobs for like a year or two, and I was an electrician for almost 7 years, beginning in 98, 99. And so I didn't really have a future, right? One that I was comfortable with. And so meeting these people who seemed to have something positive going, because they would reach out to the community and they had a message. The purpose of the group is not just to dance, but it's also to engage youth, to give them an alternative to not doing anything to get into trouble and things like that. And so, it jived with my idea of Chicanismo. And then it turns out that the guy that's the leader of the group was one of the head people of Raza Alianza. And I didn't remember him because I didn't really know all the people that were involved in the group. I only knew a couple of people that were part of the group. And he happened to be one of the people that had been involved in the creation of Raza Alianza at El Centro Community College. So it's a small world. And so I'm thinking, wait a minute, you're that guy? And now you're doing this? This must be good. So I began to learn. I began to get more involved in the group. And that sort of also motivated me to go back to school, because I wanted to research, right? Where does this come from, this idea that we are indigenous? I knew that it has something to do with the Chicano movement, because, reading the books, there was a lot of cultural nationalism, that kind of had a little backlash from certain sectors of the Chicano community that didn't really agree with the direction that Chicanismo was taking, especially those that, wanted to, really immerse themselves completely in indigeneity. And I found that to be, curious, but I didn't really have a frame of reference until I met them. I'm like, oh, so that's what they meant. That's what these people were talking about, these people. Because this idea of Chicanismo being embedded within indigenism goes back to the Chicano movement, even before that. Right? My research and my dissertation shows that it goes back to, at least here in the United States, it really starts in the 40s, even before the Chicano movement. So I was like, wow, this is interesting. And so just being part of, being a member of the Aztec dance group, and then beginning to get involved in ceremonies like, sweat lodges, medicine meetings, doing medicine meetings and ceremonies with people in Mexico, indígenas, huicholes, raramuris, Tohono O'odham out in Arizona, and people in New Mexico, and just beginning to travel and making all these connections, I got really this idea really started to surface. Like, what is it about being indigenous that draws a lot of Chicanos? Because a lot of Chicanos, a lot of Mexican Americans, even in Mexico, right? If you go to Mexico, people understand that they have indigenous ancestry, but no one really will tell you what tribe they're from, right? No one really knows. They couldn't tell you the first thing of ceremony or what indigenous people life is like unless you come from a community. And so I was thinking, how is it that you have a group of people here in the United States, Mexican Americans, that have really taken to this notion of indigenous identity? And so that became like this driving idea that I just kept hammering at it and doing research on my own. This is before I went to school. And then one day in 2004, this is 10 years after I had graduated high school, I decided, well, it's been 10 years since I graduated. It's either now or never. Either I'm going to go back to school now, or I'm going to be an electrician for the rest of my life.
Before we move on to that part of your life, I want to ask you the name of the groups that you were involved, just so we get that on record.
Right. So, and I'm still involved with these groups, to be honest. So the danza group it's a Nahuatl name, and I'll say the Nahuatl name first, and then I'll give you the translation. It's Mitotilistli Yaoyolotli, and that basically means dance of the heart of the warrior. And that's just a dance group, or troupe if you prefer. And the dance troupe is part of a larger community that we call Calpuli. Calpuli in Nahuatl means community, basically, right? Or barrio. It depends on the context. And so we people, Mexicas, we call ourselves Mexicas. Mexica being the original name of the Aztec people. And so those of us that have assumed this indigenous identity, that are danzantes, that belong to communities called Calpulis, we usually call ourselves Mexicas. So this Calpuli that we have, this community is called Tonalpili. And Tonalpili means children of the sun. So our community is called the community of the children of the sun, Calpuli Tonalpili. And so those are the groups that I've been involved with now for going on 20 years.
Great. Well, thank you. And now we can move on to what got you into college and where you started college.
So I started college at El Centro Community College, 2004. And what got me going to college was I came to this realization that I had been out of high school for 10 years. I had been in the military. I had, had these different life experiences, failed dreams of an aspiring musician and things like that. And I said, well, and also I should add that through danza I had met a lot of people that I probably would have never met. And a lot of these people happened to be immigrants. And I would see how these people who were immigrants had been successful despite the fact that they hadn't been born here, right? And I was thinking, how is it that me, a person that was born here, has nothing to show for? And these people who immigrated, that have been here maybe 10, 15, 20 years, but weren't born here, have made it in life. They've done something with their life. So that also kind of inspired me. I was like, if they can do it, I know I can do it. So it was part of that. So it was part inspiration on the success of others. It was part my own drive and desire to research, and it was also my own sort of motivation to finally do something with my life. I had been out of school for 10 years. I was 28. I was approaching the age of 30, and I had really nothing to show for in my life. And so it was something that was personal to me. I was like, how is it that I'm almost 30 years old and I have nothing to show for it? And so that's when I said, you know what? I'm going to apply to a Central Community College. I'll start in night school, and I'll take a class, see how that goes, see if I like it. And that's exactly what I did. So I took my English. Actually, I took 2 classes. So I took English and I took algebra. And I was thinking, okay, I think I can do this. But I did that for 3 semesters. So I was still, working during the day full time. And then at night, 2 times or 3 times a week, whatever it was, I would go to school. And then finally I said, and I was doing well. I was getting A's and B's. So I was thinking, okay, I can do this. And I came to a point when I said, well, I can either spend the next 10 years at El Centro trying to get an associate's degree at doing night classes, or I can just go full time. But the thing is that if you're going to go full time, you're going to have to probably do it during the day, because that's when most of the classes that you're going to need to get an associate's are done in the daytime. So I had to make a decision. And the good thing was that I didn't have a family. I didn't have any, I wasn't married, right? So it was easier for me to make the decision to work part-time and to go to school full-time, because I didn't have that responsibility. And at El Centro is where I met my wife, and I had so I was thinking about transferring, and I was looking at different colleges, and being a member of at El Centro, I was a member of Phi Theta Kappa, which is the honor society for community colleges here in Texas. I'm not sure if I think it's nationwide, because we went to nationals, but I knew that with 55 credits I could transfer to SMU. And around that time that I achieved those 55 credits is when back then we weren't married, we were just boyfriend and girlfriend when my wife got pregnant. And so I had another big decision to make. Do I stop here and just get my associates and go back into the workforce now that I'm going to be a father, and take care of my family? Or do I take a risk and see how far I can go? And the good thing is that my wife has always been very supportive of me. She has been there through thick and thin, and she has helped me, go through, school, getting my associates, getting my bachelor's, getting, then master's, Ph.D. She's been there for me the whole time. And so it was a good thing that I had someone that was very supportive, and that also that Mija, my child was young, that she was almost a teenager as she is now. That would have been difficult to kind of have a full-time, to go full-time to school, right? And so
what did you major in?
I majored in Mexican American Studies. So I double majored in, so it's weird because you don't really think of an associate's degree and having double major, but I did. So I had Mexican American Studies, which was under the Ethnic Studies rubric, and also fine art. And so when I transferred to SMU, so before we get to SMU, so at El Centro, I met my wife. I was in the honor society. I was also responsible for being, I don't know if the group still exists, but I was one of the founding members of LOMAS, Latino Organization of Mentors and Scholars. And I was the president of the group for a year, the first year that it started. I was also involved in, what was that other group that we had there?
The Association of Latinos in Arts and Studies.
Oh, right. So the Association of Latino Arts and Studies. And so, I've always been interested in art, even though as a kid I didn't really do a lot of art, but I've always been interested in it. I didn't really get into art until after high school, and, especially at El Centro is really where I began to explore my art. And in fact, I won several competitions at El Centro, and they have a couple of my paintings somewhere. They bought some of my paintings, so they're hanging somewhere in El Centro. I don't know where they are. And so I know that hopefully they're still there. And so I was a member of ALAS, and I guess I'm not going to really get into too much this part of the story, because that's a whole nother story again. But ALAS was an organization that was not part of the school. It was an outside organization that I wasn't. I guess you could say I was a founding member because I was there at the beginning, but I wasn't the one who thought of the idea of creating the group, and I wasn't an officer in the group. I was just a member of the group. But this group, ALAS, we used to meet over in West Dallas at this gentleman's house, que se llama Tomás Bustos. He's he's Mexican American. He's a longtime Dallas resident. I'm not sure if he's from Dallas originally, but he's lived here most of his life, and he studied under Octavio Medellin. And if you do some research over here at Meadows, the School of Art, you'll see that they have some of his papers and some of his early works. So Octavio Medellin. Octavio Medellin is the founder of the Art Institute of Dallas. Before it was the Art Institute of Dallas, when they changed the name but he's the founder of that school, and it started in Oak Cliff, and then they moved it to over here where I'm not even sure if it's still there. It used to be over here in like Far East Dallas, off of Ferguson and
I think it's
30.
still
It's still there. So he studied under Octavio Medellin, and so he was the founding member, and a couple other people. A guy named Jesus Simi Alvarado from El Paso. In fact, he's from El Paso. He's back in El Paso. He does a lot of the murals. When you go back there, you might want to talk to him, connect to him. And he was also part of Alas, and a bunch of other people. And so this group, we used to do what we called peñas, and a peña is like a gathering, kind of like a floricanto, right? And we used to have poets and musicians, and they would come and they would get on the stage. We have a little impromptu stage going, and they would sing and things like that. We would have the danzantes come in and do danza, do a couple of danzas. We would have all our art along the walls, and we'd invite people to come in. And what we were trying to do is we were trying to convince the local leadership here in Dallas that we needed something artistic for the local Latino artists. And out of that, long story short, out of those peñas and bringing in city council people, the mayor, and all these other folks that came to these peñas, so we would have a peña like at least once a month, and we did this for at least 2 years straight, maybe more. Out of that, the idea for the Latino Cultural Center emerged. So I haven't done anything on that as far as historically, but I do want to write something up because I don't think that story has been properly told. And I plan on interviewing Tomas Bustos here pretty soon, so I can get that story straight from him, because he was the one that was deeply involved. He would go to all the meetings with the city council. I was just kind of in the sidelines. I was doing my art thing. I didn't really care about all that stuff.
Awesome. So thank you for that story. And to start talking about SMU, what prompted you to come to SMU, and why did you choose SMU over any other school in the area?
Yeah, so as you know, Professor John Chavez, his alma mater is the University of Michigan. And so we went to a conference when I was still an undergraduate. He invited me and this other student. The other student didn't go, but it was just me, him, and his wife. And we went to this conference that they do every year to celebrate the inauguration of, I don't know if they call it Chicano Studies program or Mexican American Studies. Either or, he was, Chavez was one of the first people that helped found that program up there. And so Foley was there, Neil Foley. That's when I met him before he came to SMU. So I was looking at the University of Michigan for my graduate studies. I was looking at UT. I was looking at I even looked at Stanford. All these other places where you can find your traditional Chicano Mexican American studies programs, or at least classes that you can take. And but I think what sold me on SMU was the fact that they gave me a transfer scholarship. So going back to my years at El Centro. So after Mija was born, I decided that it was in my best interest to at least complete the associates. I already had 60-something hours, and I think to get the associates was 80-something, 82 hours or something like that. And so I said, I might as well just go ahead and finish. It took me another year, two more semesters after she was born. She was born in January of 2007. So it took me that spring semester and then plus, another whole academic year to finish. So I graduated in 2008, May of 2008 with an associate's. And being part of Phi Theta Kappa, being active in the community through my Calpulli, and through my Calpulli I was able to accrue over 200 hours of service learning, because through the danza we go out to, or at least we used to go to different community centers and work with kids, at-risk youth, things like that. So I was able to accumulate a lot of hours. I had a 4.0 GPA at El Centro. And so all those things allowed me to apply for what they call the transfer scholarship that SMU has in partnership with the Dallas County Community College District. And I don't know how it is still, and I'm still kind of vague on the exact details, but I know that I think they select the top 10, and they give those top 10 students, because you have to come in to do an interview, kind of like what we're doing now, but with 3 people. They ask you different questions, and you have to submit all the usual requisites of essays and things like that, application. And they select the top 10 people, and they give those top 10 a full ride. And I think the next top 10 or the next 20, they give them like a half ride, half scholarship. And so I was one of the lucky people that got the top 10 full ride scholarship. And so I said, well, look, I'm a father. I have a toddler. We really can't afford to move anywhere else. The University of Michigan reached out to me and they showed interest, but I never followed up with them because by that point SMU had already reached out to me and had told me that I was going to get that. So that's really, I wanted to stay in Dallas because, back then I felt like that was the best thing for the family because at the time, our relatives were helping us out. My wife was working, and I was coming to school full time, and we needed someone to watch Yoli, and they were helping us out. So it just worked out perfect. That I didn't have to make a choice of having to relocate my entire family to a place where we don't know anyone and try to figure out what we're going to do. Being a young couple with a toddler, right? So it just worked out perfect, and so I ended up coming to SMU, and the funny thing is that I followed the same, scholarship that I was doing at El Centro. I didn't enroll in the history program here at SMU. I was in the ethnic studies program, and so I don't know if it still exists because it's always kind of been in the books, but they've always had like one or two people that are part of that program. I know when I was an undergraduate, I think it was only 3 of us. There was 2 of us doing the Mexican American component and 1 person doing the African American component, and so. So I did Mexican American studies. Yeah. So I did Mexican American studies under ethnic studies, and so I double majored as well, and I also did fine art. I got a bachelor's in fine art over at Meadows. So I would be my time was here at SMU was usually split between Dallas Hall and the Meadows School of Art. But I spent most of my time at the Meadows School of Art in my studio doing art, and the reason I did so was because I didn't really. Even though I got to know some of the people, some of the students, and and the Chicano group that we had here, we can get into that in a minute. I didn't really engage with the students that much because I was a non-traditional student. At this point, I'm already in my early 30s. Here's an old dude. That's gonna be kind of weird hanging out with these youngsters, these late teen, early 20-year-olds. So I didn't participate in any of the Greek life. I wasn't part of. The only group that I was a member of as an undergraduate was Students for a Better Society. And with the Students for a Better Society, I'm not even sure if it's still around, but it was a bunch of us back then, and I was part of. It had different committees, and the committee that I was a part of, I forget what it was called, but what we did is we brought awareness about the death penalty. And so we organized different speakers to come in and to talk about the death penalty. And this is around the same time that a lot of those, you might have heard of these cases where people were being exonerated that had been, sentenced to life or sentenced to death as well. And so we brought some of those people in to talk, and we even had a mock electric chair over in Dallas Hall for one of the speakers that showed up. So that's really the only group that I got involved with because something that I haven't really discussed this whole time is that while I was transitioning from my old life to my indigenous life, I was also kind of an activist in the community. I was part of a group called Uproar, United People Against Racism and Oppression. This was out in East Dallas. I lived in East Dallas in a while in an urban sort of collective. It was kind of like a hippies commune of the 70s, but it was in the urban setting. And so when I lived there for about 4 years. This is when I was going to El Centro. And we did a lot of actions with like Rainforest Action Network, with Greenpeace. We traveled to different parts of the state and other parts of the country, and we would like protest. We would, you've probably seen this in different actions online, but we would stick our hands in barrels and we would chain them up so that we would try to block the passage of the trucks from going in and out of, for example, Dow Chemical is one of the places that we demonstrated. And so we would get arrested and things like that. But the good thing is that Greenpeace has a lot of money. And so what they would do is they would bail us out. So they would hire us to do these demonstrations because they would reach out to the activist community, and since we're involved in these issues, we're not getting paid for them, but we're there demonstrating, and if something happens legally, they have our back. And so that's how it worked. And so we did that for the Rainforest Action Network as well. And locally, at the local level, Uproar, what we did is we protested against racism, especially back in the early 2000s. There was a resurgence of neo-Nazism that was going on, especially in East Dallas. And so what we would do is we would not infiltrate their group, but we would people would find out where they would have their rallies or gatherings, and we would go and disrupt their meetings and things like that, and it would get physical at some time, and in some instances, and so
to document for posterity, I guess, just in case this group doesn't get documented in other forms, where exactly was the collective? Like, what streets, what neighborhoods?
I can tell you exactly where it was. And in fact, there's a movie that was made, and it was modeled after our group.
Okay.
It's called, what was the name of the movie? I think it was called Anarchist? No, The Anarchist Cookbook is the name of the movie. And it's about Dallas activists. And it was essentially modeled after, I wasn't the part of, like, the characters in the movie don't portray me specifically, but they do sort of portray other members of the group, but the names have been changed, obviously.
Okay.
But the group, our collective was on Wayne Street. Okay, so it was on Wayne Street, and I guess I could give you the address because that house has been sold, and I don't know who lives there, but it's been like over 10 years, right? 902 Wayne Street. It's in East Dallas. It's near Samuel Graham Park, near East Grand. And what's interesting is that a few houses down from where we lived in that house, there's a community school on Wayne Street. That community school, if I'm not mistaken, has been around since the 70s, and it was one of the schools, I don't know how many they founded, but it's one of the few that either was founded or that still remain, that was collaboratively founded by the Brown Berets and the Black Panthers. And in fact, some of the people that belonged to our collective, they would go and volunteer at the community school. And it's basically, for kids, for small kids, the community school for small kids. And then around the corner from there on the, if you go, so there's Wayne Street, there's East Grand, and then right before East Grand, there's a small street called Gurley. So Gurley, Gurley. So you go down Gurley all the way down to Beacon, if I'm not mistaken. It's been a while since I've been through there. So it's Beacon, and then there's a Krishna temple over there. And there's a restaurant called Kalachandis. And we used to go and eat there all the time. This is back when I was a vegan. Well, not a vegan, I was a vegetarian. So I wasn't fully vegan, but yeah, when I was part of that collective, because almost everybody in that collective was at least a vegetarian. So there was no meat products allowed in the house, the routine of being a vegetarian. And so on Sundays, the temple has, I don't know if they still do it, but back then they would offer free food for the community. And so we would go on Sunday nights and we'd, break bread with the temple goers over at the temple.
I used to live a few blocks from the temple. I didn't realize that they had free meals.
What? You never went to the free meals?
But I
you
did
missed.
I did go to the restaurant for lunch.
Yeah, the restaurant's awesome. I haven't been there in a long time, but it's awesome. So yeah, so that's where we were. That was our base of operations, I guess you could say.
Well, thank you for telling me that part of your life. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I have various tangents in my life.
No, and I've tried to get to them, so I hope we've gotten into most of them. So once you majored, you were in the art school or here at SMU or in the ethnic studies program. Since the ethnic studies program was so small, I don't imagine there was too many issues, but especially in the art school, since that's where you spent most of your time. What was the Chicano Latino presence in the art school, and were you treated differently, or how were you treated as a Latino or Chicano?
Yeah, I can't really say for the rest of the school because, like I said, I didn't really engage with the rest of the school. I mean, there's still parts of SMU, not the new buildings, but even some of the old ones that were around back 10 years ago that I maybe set foot once. and I couldn't tell you like what goes on in those schools. Like I know there's a business school, and I think I've been in there like twice. So I couldn't tell you about the rest of SMU, but I know that for at least the art school where I spent most of my time, it was great. I mean, there was, I think as far as Latinos, besides myself, there was a graduate student when I was there. I forget his name now. I think his last name was Cruz or his first name. Because you know Cruz can be the first or last name. I don't remember if it's first or last name, but I think Cruz was in his name. He was getting his master's in fine arts. I think his name was Bernardo Cruz. Who else was there besides me? There was a few other people. There was even a teacher from I believe she was from Argentina. Her name was, oh man, it's been a while. I don't remember, but she used to teach digital arts, and I took a class with her. So it wasn't as diverse as you would expect at a public school, like a public state school like UT or something like that. But it was diverse. There was African American students there, Asian Americans. It was predominantly white, of course, this is SMU. But it was diverse, and besides maybe a few undergrads, you know, young, mostly girls, most of the time these were girls that, you know, act a little weird around people that are not like them. But that was the extent of it. It wasn't like, I never saw or experienced any outright discrimination, prejudice, or racism when I was over there. In fact, it was, I mean, like I said earlier, I mean, the best time that I had, besides my time over here, you know, as a graduate student, as an undergraduate, was over at the middle school. Through the middle school, I was able to go to New York City for 2 weeks. It was part of the art program where we, during the winter break in January, we went to New York City. We stayed at the Beacon Hotel, like it's kind of like Midtown Manhattan, and we had access to different galleries. We visited a bunch of galleries. We went to the MoMA, you know, the Museum of Modern Art. We took a train up to this place, I think it's called Beacon, New York, named after the hotel, or you know, or the hotel is named after that place. And there's a little satellite museum out there that's run by MoMA as well. The Dia Beacon, I believe it's called. So that's one thing. And then something else through the art school is that I got my first taste of Taos, New Mexico. Because I had been to New Mexico many, many times. One of my best friends that we still keep in touch today is from New Mexico. I met him when he and his family lived in Fort Worth, and he's a Danzante, and that's how I met him. We used to go out to Albuquerque all the time because he's from Albuquerque, and we would visit, you know, with him for, you know, we'd stay with him for a weekend and then come back. And I did that at least once a year. And, you know, this is before I was a dad, you know, before I was married. But I had never been, my experience in New Mexico was just going straight to Albuquerque and back. That was it. I had never been anywhere else. Maybe Santa Fe, you know, but I had never made it to Taos. So through the art school, you know, SMU has that satellite campus in Taos. Have you been there?
No, I haven't.
So you go out there for a month, and you're out in the mountains. You're out, and it's raining almost every day, off and on. It's not too hot. It's not too cold. But you get to experience nature. You get to experience the culture, and you get to see firsthand how, you know, the different cultures of New Mexico have sort of interacted. The Nuevo Mexicano, Hispano people, the Native American people, you know, the Taos, Pueblo, and the Anglo community that's pretty much, you know, been there since at least in large part the 70s, right? I mean, they predate the 70s, but really the 60s and the 70s when you had the whole communal, going back to this idea of the communes, right? The communal movement and with the hippies and all that. And so you get to see all that firsthand instead of just reading about it in history books. And so that was really something that I really share and cherish. And so because of that experience, once, you know, I was in the program, in the Ph.D. program, and I got the opportunity to teach my own class, you know, they give you the option to apply to teach in Taos. I went out there twice because I just love it so much, you know, being out there in the mountains. And so that's another thing that I really, you know, remember that I cherish from being in the art program.
So 2 things that I want to ask you before we go on into your graduate experience. What years were you at SMU? What years did you start your undergrad and finished? And if you had any mentors that you remember helping you or you remember influencing you as an undergrad.
So as an undergraduate, the person, I had two really, Dr. Hamilton, he's the head of the Ethnic Studies program, and Dr. Chavez, John Chavez. So Chavez mentored me in the sense that he saw in me something that perhaps maybe I didn't see in myself, because when I transferred from El Centro this was in '08. So I was in El Centro, at El Centro for almost 4 years. I started in the spring of '04, and I received my associates in May of 2008, so almost 4 years, right? And so I transferred immediately, so I just had that summer off, and then I started my undergrad experience here at SMU in the fall of 2008, and received my bachelor's in 2010, so 2 years. And so during that time that I was here, that I was just going to get my bachelor's and move on with my life, and I wasn't sure what direction I was going to take. I was thinking either I'm going to do something with my ethnic studies degree and maybe do something in teaching, or maybe continue trying to do some research and maybe publish a book on my own, through some kind of press that is not too academically inclined, or which was my other, my dream was I can become this big shot artist, right? I was doing huge painting. In fact, I have paintings that are the size of this blanket here, okay? And I would make my own frames. My frames were they stick out like this much from the wall, like 3 inches. That's how thick I made them. Because the standard is usually like 2.5, and I would make my own, and I would make them really thick, and I would stretch my own canvases, prep them, all that, the whole 9 yards. And so I got really good at doing that, and I'm not going to say that I'm like, what do you call it? What do they call those, the artists? A master, right? Of painting, but I got really good at doing oil paintings, which is something that I had struggled with a lot growing up when I started doing paint. And so I was thinking, perhaps maybe I can pursue something in art. Maybe I can do public art. Maybe I can do murals, things like that. But Chavez, I guess because he noticed, I've always been very inquisitive since I was a little kid. My mom used to call me Contreras because I'm always talking back. Contreras means being contrarian, basically. And so if someone says something, I have to say something, even if I'm wrong or, but I have to, right? And so I've learned to control that over the years. I'm not as contrarian as I used to, even though it slips out every now and then. But so being contrarian also is that in the academic setting is that I ask a lot of questions, and maybe I try to challenge someone. And so, usually most students don't challenge their professors because most students tend to be way younger than their professors, or in the case of history, most students are just in history because it's something that they have to take for a credit and they don't really care, But, since I've always had that desire to learn things and that passion for history, I would challenge Chavez. I would be like, well, Professor Chavez, isn't it true that this, that, and the other? And we wouldn't get into a debate necessarily, but he would say, well, that's debatable. That's his standard response. That's debatable. And I'd be like, I would think to myself, yeah, whatever. I know I'm right. He's wrong. But he saw something in me, right? And so he would encourage me. He said, you know what? I think you might do well in the Ph.D. program in history. Why don't you apply to it? And I said, well, I don't know if I have enough credits to apply to the history department, because under ethnic studies, you're not required to take, 12 credit hours, or is it 18 to become a history major, to get a history degree?
No idea.
I think it's like 18 or 12, one of those two. So I only had, your standard U.S. surveys, and I took a Latino, it's in film with him, the Mexican-American history class, and the African-American class with Hamilton. So those are the only, so if you multiply that by 3, so I had about 15 credit hours. But, under ethnic studies, you're able to take anthropology, archaeology, sociology, which is what I also took, because I was also interested in those things. And so if I hadn't gone the history route, I would have probably gone the anthropology route, because that's, I've always been interested in anthropology as well. But, so I applied to the program. And Chavez, he, like I said, he invited me to go to this conference that he goes to every year at the University of Michigan, And so he was trying to expose me to other ways of looking at history instead of just your standard, way of looking at it in class. And so I think if there was a mentor here at SMU, it has to be him. Besides him, I mean, the only thing that I can say that we haven't really touched upon at SMU that also kind of made me feel at home is the small Chicano group that we had here. And you might know some of these people. Some of them graduated way before you came here. But we have Eduardo Morales, who now teaches at El Centro Community College. Aaron Sanchez, who teaches at Mountain View Community College. You have Diaz, George Diaz, who I believe is at UTRGV down in the Valley, South Texas. He was also here, part of the history program. And then you had El Español, what's his name?
David Rex.
Yeah, David Rex Galindo. So he was here as well. And then you had some people from the anthropology department as well. That what was her name? She was David's girlfriend, Olivia. Olivia was her name. She was on, and so it was us. So the Chicano group that was here was basically just people who were graduate students. There was hardly any undergraduate students, because even though you have a considerable amount of Hispanic Latino students here at SMU, most of them don't call themselves Chicanos, right? And so when Chavez, told me, you should probably reach out to the Chicano group, I was like, there's Chicanos at SMU? That was my immediate response. I'm like, besides me, there's a Chicano at SMU? And so that's when I got to meet, all these guys, Aaron, Ed, and George. And so we would get together over here at Varsity and the Union Hall, and we'd just talk about, their scholarship and Chicanismo in general and things like that. So yeah, I mean, that's also something that I have very fond memories of, here at SMU, that I found a group that was, interested in some of the things that I was.
So can you tell us about your scholarship? You've already done it a little bit, but we interrupted it with your work on Dallas, which I think it's a little different than your main dissertation.
Absolutely, very different.
Again, I'm not wanting you to reveal the trade secrets, but just the basics of your scholarship and what you came here to research, right? Right.
So my research really started at El Centro. I started digging into. So to backtrack a little bit. So under my indigenous identity of Mexica, it's like any other group, right? Like it's kind of religious in this sense, because we do spiritual ceremonies and things like that, even though there's a conflict there between my, skepticism and I guess I should say atheism. I'm a full-fledged atheist. So people ask me, how can you be an atheist and also participate in the ceremony? And in fact, there's people that have gotten upset with me. They say, how dare you, come into our space as an atheist, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, look, what I believe is my business, or what I don't believe is my business. The same to you. I'm here because I enjoy the ceremony, I enjoy the process, I enjoy the fellowship that I have with, the people that I consider my family, right? And so that's why I'm here, because I like being here in this space. Whether I believe this or that or the other, or don't believe it, that's really irrelevant to me personally, and it shouldn't matter to you, right? And so I say all this to preface that when I first started on this road, we call it Mexicayot. Mexicayot means things that are Mexican, or the essence of being Mexican, that essential, the cultural, spiritual fabric of what it means to be ethnically Mexican, meaning indigenous, right? When I started on this road, even though I was a skeptic person, I not that I believed a lot of the things that I was being told, but I just sort of accepted them and went along with it, just for the sake of going along, right? To get along, as they say, go along to get along. And so, but then after being in Mexicayot for a number of years, my buddy Curly from Albuquerque and I, we sort of began to question some things that seemed to be a little too far-fetched. Some of the things that were being professed by some of the membership and some of the leaders of the various groups. And so we began to research and dig in and say, okay, where did they get this idea from? How come they said this here? And what is going on with this? And so as we did our own research, we began to find that there were some holes and that there were some, to put it nicely, some stories that are made up, I guess you could say, right? And so that's when my skepticism kicked in. I said, well, wait a minute. If this isn't true, or if this is not necessarily what they're saying, then what else is wrong? What else is going on here? And so as I began to research, I got this idea that this needs to be exposed, right? Not that and so sometimes I get this accusation that I'm trying to make our people look bad, right? And I say, well, am I the one that's really making our people look bad by researching and trying to get to the core of the truth of the matter? Or is it those individuals over there that are making up stories and convincing others that what they're saying is true? I don't know. So I'm not saying that I'm the good guy or the bad guy in this story. I'm just someone that's doing research. And so my research led me to finally come to the conclusion that in order to properly tell the story of why it is that ethnic Mexicans in the United States, those of us that have attached ourselves and immersed ourselves into this Mexica identity, into indigenous identity, that we have to go to the very source to begin. How is it that we've arrived at this point? And no one's ever done that. You know, it's always been assumed throughout the Chicano movement, when it really started, right, that yes, you know, that we're mestizos, that we're half this and half that, even though DNA shows us that we're actually more indigenous, at least people who are Mexican are more indigenous than they are anything else, statistically speaking. So what I was trying to get at is, I was trying to get at the source as to where this idea of indigeneity among Chicanos comes from. And in order to do that, I had to go beyond the Chicano movement. I had to go back to Mexico. I had to dig into some of the early documentation that was done by the Spanish chroniclers, right? Some of the Spanish priests and some of the early converts that were being converted in La Escuela de Tlatelolco, for example, Sahagún, some of those early codices that tell the story of the Mexica, the migration from Aztlan down to Mexico City, all these things. So I had to go through all those documents to get an understanding of the stories that were being told and how those stories were then being filtered through the colonial period by the Spanish. And so, long story short, the origin of Chicano indigeneity doesn't rest completely and solely on indigenous people themselves. It also has, in large part, to do with the Criollo and the Mestizo population that began to assume this Mexican identity in the years that predate the Mexican War for Independence from Spain. Because in order for Mexico, at least the leadership, which happened to be mainly Spanish and Criollo, but at least on the Criollo side of it, in order for those people to convince themselves that they're better off throwing the yoke of the Spanish completely, they have to assume a new identity. The same way that it happened here with the American Revolution, right? If you look at the Boston Tea Party, those people, what did they do when they protested, when they threw the tea overboard? They dressed as Mohawk Indians. Why? Because they're assuming an American identity. They're saying, we are a different people from you over there. And the same thing happened in Mexico. The Criollos began to assume the identity of the next inheritors of the great Mexican civilizations. And so what they would do is they would compare themselves to the Mexica Aztec that came before them, and then before them they compared themselves also, tracing the line back through the Maya, through the people of Teotihuacan. And I don't think the Olmec had been, at that point, been discovered yet. But they were making the connection that they were the next iteration of the great Mexican civilization. And so by doing so, they assumed a Mexican identity, even though they were technically, ethnically Spanish. And so that idea of indigeneity is something that's rooted from the very beginning with Mexican nationalism. And that's one thing that comes out of my research is that the Mexicano that we practice, that we follow, even though it's changed, because everything changes over the years, right? It, at least originally, when it first started out, was rooted in this very deep Mexican nationalism that at times was even xenophobic and anti-Semitic as well. And so my research is still under embargo, so most people haven't seen it. You've seen it because I've shared it with you. I don't know how much of my dissertation you read, but there's a few others that have read it that I've shared it with them to give me some feedback, because I'm trying to work, and convert it into a book eventually. But most people that are still immersed today in Mexicano and all these traditions really have no idea, the very deep origins of the tradition that they follow. And that was my intention originally, that I wanted, not that I wanted to expose it to make Mexicano look bad and the Mexica look bad, but to show people this is where all this comes from. And I'm comfortable with the fact that I still follow it, even despite the fact of its origins, because I know what it is today. Today it's something different. But at least I'm comfortable knowing that this tradition has a specific origin. And yes, it might not be as rosy as one would like, but I mean, whose tradition, whose family, even your own family, how pristine is your own family tradition? How far back does your specific religiosity or culture go back? And if you go far back enough, you're going to find something that might not be so palatable, And so that was my intention, but I've gotten some pushback from certain people that feel like I'm sort of denigrating Mexicano because I'm exposing the dirty laundry, per se. So
since we're talking about your research, I wanted to ask how SMU supported your research and your work while you were in graduate school.
Well, besides the fact that, as you well know, the history department through the Clements Center has various grants that we get, and so we get the full ride for our scholarship. We get funded throughout our graduate program, but also the Clements Center provides for summer research. So most of my research, I conducted it with money that I was able to save on my own, and also through the grants that I got from the Clements Center itself. And I got a few grants here and there from other places, but for the most part, I would say that, I don't know how much of the money is tied directly to SMU as a whole, and how much of it is just the history department and the Clements Center on its own. But as far as my experience being at SMU, being in the history department that's tied to the Clements Center for Southwest Studies, I'm very happy with the support financially and also emotionally, right? And that they were able to provide. Most of the professors there were always willing to listen to you when you had a grievance, or if you had a complaint, or even if just to lend an ear when you were going through some hard times. There's been a few professors that I've sat down with, and they've loaned me their ears, and I've been able to go through several issues with them, and they were able to provide some feedback. So it wasn't just monetary, it wasn't just educational, but they were also there, emotionally, to be there for you in time of need, I would say. I mean, I don't know what anyone else's experience has been, but that was my experience.
We definitely have a very nice, we were both produced by departments with people that are not necessarily the stereotypical academic.
Yeah, that's true.
That alienates the graduate students. But so we're lucky on that. But another thing that I wanted to ask you,
George Diaz would say that we're spoiled over here at SMU.
Yes, I've heard it before from him.
So, yeah.
So I wanted to ask you one more thing before we end the interview, and that's you're in Aaron Sanchez's publication along with someone else that I cannot remember their name, if you can.
Oh, Nadia Hanna?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. You together wrote the Latinos and Latino History of Southern Methodist University.
Right.
I want to ask you anyone could go online and read that, but why you produced that, your findings, and the impact that made on you.
Well, I think there were several things that went on with that publication and the research. At that time, when I was an undergraduate, I think Aaron was in his first or second year as a grad student. This was, I think, it was published in 2011, late 2011. So that was my senior year, my last year. No, 20. Oh, I'm missing my days now. No, I think it was my first year as a graduate student.
Okay.
That's right. And so, so what happened there was that I'm not sure if that office still exists. There used to be an office here at SMU called the Office of Multicultural Affairs. And they used to be headed by a guy named Fernando Salazar. And in fact, he went to Skyline with me. He was, I think, 1 or 2 years ahead of me. I remember him from Skyline. We weren't friends back then, but when, we've known each other and we've exchanged a few words over the years. But yeah, so when I came to SMU, he was one of the few people that I knew here. And so we got this idea. It was really his idea. It was Fernando's idea because I guess he knew. He didn't tell us at the time, but I think he kind of dropped a few hints that the Office of Multicultural Affairs was going to go through some change, and that he was seeking other employment opportunities because of it. And so I think what he wanted to do was he wanted to document the history of Latinos at SMU because he felt that no one was ever going to do it. And this also tied into the anniversary of SMU's founding in 2011. That's what it was too. So it was those two things that came together at the same time. And so he had this idea that, look, since SMU is going through all this pomp and circumstance to celebrate the 100th year anniversary of its founding, and they're doing all these different events, and if you go down to certain parts of SMU, you'll find different placards and things that sort of announce the founding of SMU and who were the people there and all this stuff, right? And so he was saying, we need some of that for our community. We need to find out who were the first Latinos here at SMU, what were they doing, things like that. And so Nadia and myself were in charge of doing the deep research. I did most of the research. We went through basically virtually all of the SMU rotundas, the yearbooks dating to the very first one. And in fact, some of the first ones, I guess I'll say it, I mean, who cares? But some of the very early rotundas, like if you go back enough to 2011, not 2011, but 1911, 1912, through the early teens and the early 20s, you find some very disturbing imagery. You see people in blackface. You see people dressed as minstrel performers, and very racist things. And then I guess it's something that for the time should be expected, but it was kind of disturbing to see some of that. But the point that I'm trying to get at, that I was very shocked to find that going back to the very first year of the founding of SMU, you had Latinos that were attending school, and it was basically, I don't know if you've seen the publication that we did, but there's an image in the front, the cover of that publication shows two gentlemen seated and then this lady standing behind them. That's the photo from 1911, and those three students, the yearbook and the documentation that we collected says that they were the representatives of Mexico, but I did a little digging, and it turns out that they were from the Little Mexico neighborhood that no longer exists. So they were Mexican, right? So back then, if you were Mexican, you were just Mexican. You weren't really Mexican American. And so they represented Mexico because they were Mexican, but they were really Mexican Americans, right, from Dallas. And so that was something that really surprised me. I mean, I was expecting to find the first instance of Latinos maybe in the 40s, but for sure in the 50s, right? Mm-hmm. But, when I did because I did most of that deep historical research, and Nadia, she was in charge of interviewing folks. She interviewed several people, including Adelfa Callejo, who was also, if you read that pamphlet that we did, she was the first Latina to graduate from the law school here at SMU. She was one of, if not the first Latina in Dallas to practice law, and she was like the second Latina in the entire state to practice law, something to that effect. So she was very important, and she passed away a number of years ago, not even 10 years ago now. But so Nadia was in charge of doing the interviews. I was in charge of doing the research, and then Aaron was in charge of constructing the narrative based on our research. And so that's how come all three of us collaborated on this project. And Fernando is the one. He was basically the person with the idea. And like I said, his main goal was to document, because he felt that not only was he going to be leaving, and he didn't know what the future of the office would be. And I think it's changed now. I don't even know if it's still called the Office of Multicultural Affairs. And so he was unsure of the future of the office that he held, and he also didn't like the fact that SMU was, celebrating its 100th year anniversary, and Latinos seemed to be kind of left behind and out of the picture. And so our job was to come and say, hey, don't forget about us. We've been here since the very beginning, all right? And something else I should say is that not necessarily the office that he was in, because, it's been, 50 years now? But the Office of Multicultural Affairs started out as an office that was occupied by Chicanos. SMU, in my research for the Dallas Chicano movement that I've done, I found that SMU had its own Chicano group, the SMU Chicanos. They just call themselves Los Chicanos, that was their name. And it turns out that the Office of Multicultural Affairs was an office that was created because of the efforts of different groups here at SMU, minority groups that were demanding for such an office to be created. So Los Chicanos, an African American group, basically, I don't know if there was Asian Americans or if they had a group, but I know it was at least those two, African Americans and Mexican Americans, who advocated for this office to be created, the office that Fernando used to hold. And he told me also that the office, the original office, was housed in the structure that used to be where that fountain is, like if you're headed towards the park, like going out that way by the garage, you know how there's that fountain there? Well, there used to be a building there, and that's where the Office of Multicultural Affairs used to be, and that's where the Chicanos used to meet, and that's where the African American groups used to meet as well. And so he wanted us to document that because he understood the significance of not just the anniversary, but also the significance of documenting this for posterity, like you were saying earlier.
Well, probably my last formal question would be what you've done since graduating with your Ph.D. here at SMU in history, and how SMU has helped your career since then.
Well, what have I done? So I've taught at a few places. I've taught at UT Arlington. I taught there for a semester teaching Mexican American history. I taught over at UNT Dallas, which is a new campus. It used to be a satellite campus of UNT in Denton, but now I think it's been its own satellite, its own individual campus, independent, for about 10 years now. And that one's over in South Oak Cliff, actually, in my part of town. So I was there for 2 semesters, but I was only an adjunct there. And I just got back from teaching full-time as a visiting assistant professor at the University of Texas at El Paso this past academic year. That was a wonderful experience. I was close to New Mexico. I've been to El Paso numerous times because some of the ceremonies that we conduct, we do them in El Paso. And we have ties with Mexica groups out in El Paso. So, it wasn't the first time that I had been out there, but it was the first time that I had actually spent a significant amount of time in El Paso, getting to know the place. Because we usually would just drive in, do the ceremony, and drive back for the weekend. And so I never got to know El Paso. So that was good to be able to do that and to spend some time and to be there at the border. I think that my experience and my education through SMU has really allowed me, I think that the best thing that it's done for me is that it's given me the opportunity to learn how to teach. Because when I came into the program, I wasn't sure if I wanted to teach. My like, as you know, as an academic and as a researcher, we usually, as historians that conduct like deep historical research, that's our mainstay, right? We want to be out in the archives. We want to be out in the field, conducting interviews, talking to folks, and creating the narrative of the story that we want to tell. We don't necessarily want to be in a classroom teaching a bunch of students, half of them who probably don't want to be there to begin with, right? And so my experience post graduation, with my Ph.D., being out there in the workforce and harkening back, to what I learned from my teachers here, my professors, Chavez, Hamilton, I've been able to learn and to get a better sort of appreciation for the art of teaching, which is something that I'm now beginning to fully, not completely understand, and to say that I'm only 2 years out, so I wouldn't call myself a master professor, if that's such a thing, if you can frame it in those terms. But I am gaining that appreciation for the craft and for the art of teaching itself. And so now, as I've returned from El Paso after being out there for a year, I'll be starting at Mountain View College this fall semester, and I'll be there with Aaron Sanchez. So it's going to be two of us from SMU teaching at the local community college, which, at least from what I know, it's three of us. You have Ed at El Centro Community College doing history, and now myself and Aaron are going to be at Mountain View doing history as well. So SMU has been very supportive, not only of the students that come out of the community college in Dallas, but now also some of these students like myself, after graduating from SMU, we're able to go back and teach at those same institutions. And hopefully we'll be able to train the next generation of historians coming out of Dallas. And there's just so many stories that need to be told about Dallas, and I find myself conflicted because my main research interest is indigeneity, this branch of history that's over here. But I'm also being a native Dallasite, born and raised, I'm also very interested in Dallas history because that history hasn't been adequately told, at least not the Mexican-American version of it. Mm-hmm. Most of the history, even the most recent history, there's a few books that have been out in the last 10 years or so that have told the history of Dallas, especially the racial politics of Dallas. Either don't get it completely right, or most of the research that they use to tell the story of Dallas is based on archival information from other cities like Houston or San Antonio. And so the Mexican-American Chicano history of Dallas, as told by people that have gone through the archives, like deeply gone through the archives here in Dallas, has not been properly told. And so I'll find myself having to choose and my, how am I going to spend my time moving forward? Am I going to keep going in this, spend most of my time on the indigenous side, or am I going to try to carve some time and some space out to do some Dallas history while being a father, et cetera, et cetera? So it's difficult. But I would say that the lessons that I learned here at SMU, how to manage my time and how to be a better researcher, and all the advice that I've gotten, suggestions and comments that I've gotten on how to become a better writer, all those things have been very useful to me and are going to hopefully will be useful in converting my dissertation into a book someday. That's the ultimate goal, right? You want to, as an academic, as a historian with a Ph.D., besides teaching, you want to publish your material. You want the world to know what you know, and so hopefully. And I know it'll happen soon, but that's the ultimate goal here, I think.
Well, before we end the interview, I have to ask, or want to ask, if there's anything that I've left out that you want to touch on before we turn off the camera.
Let's see. I don't know. Have we left anything out? I'm sure there's a bunch that's been.
Or you can come back for a second interview.
Or I could come back with some. Maybe, I'll tell you what, I'll come back for a second interview after I publish my first book. How about that?
Great. Well, thank you.